Hi everyone, I'm very happy to join you from Argentina with our talk on Southern Andean migrations. I start by saying that the local Huarpe communities from the study area, from the Uspallata Valley, are a formal component of our project. I'm going to be sharing with you some preliminary discussions on three main axes of analysis regarding migration dynamics. First, we're going to be looking at time and the role of migrations in the conformation of small-scale mobile and sedentary societies during the last 1500 years. Then we're going to zoom in order to characterize the economic, demographic, and social composition of the migrant groups. And then finally, we're going to zoom out in order to understand the macro-regional context where these recorded migrations took place. So let's take a look at the region we're talking about. The Calingasta-Uspallata Valley, it's a north-south biogeographic corridor east of the Andes in Argentina, which is precisely located near the southern frontier of agropastoral economies. And this holds a great potential in terms of the interaction between societies with different forms of organization. The bioarchaeological record from these valleys shows persistent occupations and the formation of cemeteries for the first time during the last 2000 to 1500 years before present. So we began by building a macro-regional strontium isoscape connecting the Pacific coast with the eastern lowlands in Argentina. This implied sampling rodents, sampling plants, in order to make a first effort in this southern latitude of the Andes to start looking at migrations from the amazing perspective that strontium offers. So this is one of the isoscapes that we've developed recently, which shows that, I'm not going to go into details, but there are striking differences between the main biogeographic regions across this part of the Andes, which are very tightly connected with the age and composition of the rocks. So this is a region where the actual strontium on the landscapes reflects what theory dictates should be happening. Now, going into the bioarchaeological record from these valleys, from the Uspallata Valley particularly, we've analyzed a first set of samples from different cemeteries covering the last 1500 years. And what you can see here is that there is a group of 27 samples that are fully coincident with the local rodents from the region, from a larger region. But this is basically what we consider it's a local sample all along these last 2,100 years. But then we have an amazing, in terms of our question, group of 11 samples, which are quite distinct from what we think are the locals and from the local regional signal. This here is a group of 11 samples, a very preliminary, however important, first group of what we think can be considered as migrants, and we are going to be discussing that. This is going to be very short. Here in this kind of light red, you have what we reconstruct of the local range of the local people. The Pacific Ocean can be discarded on the basis of dietary information that shows a null role for marine foods. And then on this light brown, you have what could be possible source area for the migrants. To put it shortly, we believe that there is a clear situation of equifinality where we're very capable of identifying non-local people, but not so capable of identifying their precise geographic source. And that's going to be discussed in the future in the light of multiple proxies. So when we look at migration through time, and this is very simple, we have the middle period, the Andean middle period between 700 and 1200 AD, and we basically have no record of migration. All the samples from that period from different sites are basically local. And then you have an amazing record for this relatively tight period within the late intermediate period in the Andes, where basically almost half, more than half of the individuals that we analyzed are basically non-local people, and that we inferred as migrants. So we have a preliminary basis to suggest that there is an immigration pulse within Uspallata in this period between 1200 and 1400 years AD. Now, if we zoom in with a kind of artistic drawing from the pioneer archaeologists who excavated these, basically most of these sites, we can zoom in, and this is very preliminary, in the composition of the migrant groups. Most of the migrants come from one particular site, Las Colonias site, which has a minimum number of 119 individuals, and which appears to represent, let's say, families. We have men, we have women, we have a large number of sub-adults. So while the demographic analysis needs to be continued, we have evidence to suggest that quite likely whole family groups were being buried here. Continuing the zooming in process, we look at their economy. And basically what you have here in yellow are the migrants, and in purple, the locals. Basically the migrants cluster very close with the C4 farmers theoretical endpoint. So, and they have, as you can see there on the right, a very tight isotopic niche, much tighter, much smaller than the isotopic niche of the local people. So we know that they are intensive farmers of C4 plants, quite likely maize, and that they occupied a very restricted isotopic niche. So we have a situation where we can suggest that these are specialized migrants in economic terms, as opposed to more diverse societies in economic terms. And if we put these dietary results into a larger Andean picture, here again in violet, in purple, you have the migrants. And the migrants are very close with the people most heavily eating maize in all of the Andes, which are basically people from Quebrada Humahuaca and from Omo, from Conchopata, in the central Andes, in the south central Andes. So these are heavily C4 people, and that's remarkable, particularly in this context of the southern Andes, where these high maize signals are not as common. And there might be a correlation between migration and maize intensification. That's something we want to explore in the light of larger samples. We cannot say much more on that, but it's a very possible situation. And finally, the last step of the zooming in process, we looked at the morphometric characteristics of the human craniofacial variation. And we know that there are biological differences to some extent between locals and migrants, particularly some of those in the cranial base, as you can see here in the A image, but particularly in the shape of the base of the crania, which retains a stronger phylogenetic, a stronger population history signal, suggesting that there might be some biological distance between these migrants and locals. And that's something we want to explore in the future with genomic information. And very, very interestingly, as you can see here in image C, there are some interesting differences in terms of the prevalent patterns of the artificial deformation of the crania, which suggests that there might be also some differences in the construction of social identities here. Now we start to zoom out, and we want to see what happens with the regional demography in this area. And what you have here is all the C14 dates from the macro region, 343 dates, with an indication of when this migrant pulse is recorded. And this is quite interesting. It's near the onset of the most significant peak in the radiocarbon signal of the region. So the migrations occur with the onset of this peak, and this might quite possibly have been a possible push factor which may help us to understand some of the causes of this migration. Then we have information to suggest that there was a multicultural population in Uspallata when the Inca people arrived, when the Inca Empire arrived. As you can see here in this image, the migration pulse very, very shortly predates the local Inca arrival. So this is quite interesting in terms of the social landscape that the Inca Empire may have found when reaching this area, and in terms of the potential strategies of interaction with these people that they may have put forward. So this late intermediate period migrations have been shortly followed by the Inca expansion, and we suggest that it's quite likely that there was a multi-ethnic society at this time. And now we take a step further from our regional case, and we look at what's happening in the Andes, particularly during this late intermediate period, which is a key period in the regional prehistory associated to lots of changes. So what we can see looking at the recent work by Scafidi and Knudson and Washburn et al. Is that basically in all the central and south central Andes, the late intermediate period is characterized by very little migration. So there is a very little incidence of migration in most of these, let's say, core Andean area. While our very preliminary case from the southern Andes shows that in that same temporal period, we have a first record of prevalent migration. This is a contrast that we think needs to be explored because it may reveal under which conditions migration is an important option and under which conditions it may not be so. So we have a working hypothesis to discuss in the future, that it's that conflict, cultural insularization, as is typical of the late intermediate period, may prevail when the landscape is systematically occupied or even saturated at cases. While migration may be a more feasible, a more usual option in let's say, more open settings with lower demography, where migration is actually an option that you can take. So in order to finish, I'm going to give some local and general perspectives for human migration studies and perspectives for our research in particular. Zooming in, we will intensively characterize the migrant groups in Uspallata, including their demographics, morbidity, nutrition, paleogenetics. We will enlarge the strontium and paleodietary samples. In order, to put it shortly, we want to have like an X-ray image of the composition of these migrant groups, and also trying to know if all of the people represented in these sites are migrants or not. And then we consider it very worthwhile to zoom out and to discuss under what socio-demographic conditions is migration a feasible alternative. This is a relevant question beyond the Andes, beyond South America. And I believe, and we believe, that the Andean case might provide very interesting clues in order to answer this question. And as we mentioned recently, conflict and cultural insularization and migration could be alternative human responses, alternative social responses under different socio-demographic scenarios. We suggest that this was particularly the case in the Andes during the late intermediate period, and that's a hypothesis that we want to pursue in the future. Thank you very much.